very much. Benvenuti, buonasera. It's very strange. It's very strange to see you scattered around like that, but it is at the same time a wonderful feeling after so many months of actually working online. This is really heartwarming, and thank you for coming. Thank you very much. I have a few thanks. I would like to thank Almut and Haley and Sarah and Dina and the IT office for making this possible. They've been absolutely fantastic, as of course one knows they would be. So thank you very much. Thank you, all of you who have come. Thanks to my colleagues, those who are here and those who are watching us. Thank you for being such wonderful, supportive, cooperative, splendid human beings. And thank you to my postgraduates, some of whom are here, and some are even no longer postgraduates. Okay, so you will be wondering about this, but there is a story by Karen Blixen that I like very much and that I often quote in my lectures. My undergraduates, I think, have heard it probably too many times. But there is a reason why I want to start with this. The story, very, very briefly, is that there's a man who lived by a pond. One night is woken up by a great noise. He goes out into the night and heads for the pond. But in the darkness, running up and down, back and forth, guided only by the noise, he stumbles and falls repeatedly. He can't see where he's going. At last, he finds a leak in the dike from which water and fish are escaping. And he sets to work, he plugs the leak, and only when he has finished, he goes back to bed. The next morning, looking out of the window, he sees with surprise that his footprints have traced the figure of a stork on the ground. This is a story that is normally told to children and drawn at the same time, so that the complete stork appears only at the end of the story. Now, this story was used by Adriana Cavarero in her wonderful Tu che mi guardi, tu che mi racconti. And she writes, you know, what Blixen is asking is, when the design of my life is complete, will I see or will others see a stork? Now, I'm not claiming in any way that retirement is the end of life. I hope not. But it is the end of an era. It is the end of an important period in one's life. And I wonder, instead of asking myself the end of my life, but at the end, or at this point, can I actually see a stork myself? The stork being what I've been doing, what I have done, what I have pursued. Do I see it? Do others see it? I want to hope that if I or they do, it will not yet be complete. A beak might be visible, or a wing, or a leg. Perhaps not, because it could prove to be a kikibio trick from the story in Boccaccio, where you have the stork standing on one leg. If you clap your hands, it's supposed to fly off, but of course, if it's cooked, it will not. And the fear is that if I clap my hands, the stork would not take to the air, but topple over his only leg. Equally, I hope that my stork is not reduced merely to a leg, something that prompted our grandson, upon seeing a leg of lamb being prepared in the kitchen, to ask his mother how the lamb was faring with only 3 legs. Somewhere out there, where lambs live and graze. No, I hope that perhaps a very sketchy outline is more likely, one that can perhaps be filled with more detail or even better, will leave plenty of scope for the line to be refined and yet remain unfinished enough to allow speculation and imagination and the rest. So this is what was going through my mind when I was trying to decide what to talk to you about today. And my choice has fallen on an author that I have been lecturing, as you know, on for very many years, never managing to do him justice, and on a line of research that I have been pursuing for several years, still sketching, sometimes doodling. The author is Giacomo Leopardi, to whose work we have dedicated a research network here in Oxford, Leopardi Studies at Oxford. The line of research is rooted in the exploration of the lyric as anthropologically rooted in the function of mourning, in a sustained dialogue with the dead, articulating, embodying the discourse of loss. We devoted seminars to this, we devoted day studies, and over the past year or so, I have been editing a volume with Adele Bardazzi and Francesco Giusti, which brings together our contributions on the subject, on the relationship between mourning and loss and the lyric. So what I want to stress is that what you're going to hear is indeed farina del mio sacco, it's flour from my own bag, but at the same time, it couldn't have been there without the collaboration of these valiant young people, Olmo Calzolari with Leo, Valentina with her constant support, and Adele and Francesco's and Jenny and Francesca. It just could not be there without them. So this lecture is dedicated to my graduate students, present and past, and to the friends who provide such wonderful, wonderful feedback to my work. Okay, without any more ado, hello? Go away, Stork. Okay, a little energy was required. Okay, so I'm going to start from a moment in Leopardi's life when he stops writing poetry. Between 1823 and 1828, Leopardi's poetry fell almost completely silent, and led to a painfully born inhibition towards poetry, as well as a determined turn towards the prose of his Operette morali, his moral essays and dialogues in prose. Among the very few exceptions, there is one text that does not belong to the Canti, is not found there, but is found in the Operette morali, and it is at the beginning, it introduces the Dialogo di Federico Ruysch e delle sue Mummie, one of the most famous operette. This text is a poetic text, in fact it's a stanza di canzone, and it is widely considered by scholars as acting as a crossroads between the early canzoni and the early 20 poems that existed at that point, and the so-called Canti Pisano-Recanatesi, the great canti that he composed in 1828 when he wrote to his sister Paolina, sono tornato a scriver versi all'antica come una volta, have gone back to writing verse in the old way. What I'm going to argue is that the movement from the canzoni to what is in fact a new form, a new metrical form in Italian poetry, and that is the canzone libera leopardiana. That movement goes through a complex process of repositioning of the poetic self, that in its most extreme form, indeed, this coro dei morti, or coro di morti, chorus of dead people, leads to a total self-identification. Indeed, I would claim a self-annihilation of the poetic self, that both in its tragic and its comic configuration, I will come to that in a minute, places the lyric mode and the lyric self under huge strain. At a time when the poet is experiencing a personal, philosophical, aesthetic crisis of formidable magnitude, the acknowledgement of the death of the self, as he calls it, il decesso dell'io, informs a discourse of loss that works on two parallel levels. The loss of lyric poetry as a viable discourse about a self as dead, hence the choral voice, and paradoxically, the poetry's own loss or defeat as it ultimately fails to go beyond a perfect, as we will see, but lifeless, still, stone-like, mummified form of balance, beyond which there is no future for lyric poetry, nor any possibility for redress. So I'm actually letting the cat out of the pigeon. The cat out of the pigeon. Never mind, you know what I mean. I got my idioms crossed. I'm going to let the cat among the pigeons, because I'm actually going against what scholarship so far has said, that this would appear to be, this coro would appear to be the peak of Leopardi's lyric discourse. I think that it is actually a potential grave for it, which he then manages to overcome. So this is a story that ends well, but it has to go through this text, and I'll try to explain how that happens. I'm going to start with a metaphor. Hello? Is it working? Sorry, I'm trying to change the slide, but it's not working. Ah, okay. It's not a great slide, but it's 1824, and that's not the metaphor. Morali, okay, the body sepulchre, next slide, the body sepulchre. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this metaphor of the body sepulchre as it appears in some of Leopardi's letters between 21 and 24. These are letters that he writes to his friend Giordani, and as you can see, what he expresses here is a life that is very much like death. La vita che in queste condizioni è solo una morte. Io già sento d'essere morto. I already feel I'm already dead. Non mi convengono più gli uffizi che si fanno ai vivi. You can no longer offer me the kind of rituals that you offer to the living. The rituals I should be offered are funerary ones. Importantly, in the Zibaldone, in 25, when he'd already written many of the operette, io sono, mi si perdoni la metafora, un sepolcro ambulante che porto dentro di me un uomo morto, un cuore sensibilissimo che più non sente. I am a walking sepulchre. Not only that, When he writes the canzone Ad Angelo Mai, he dedicates it to Count Trissino, and this is what he writes to him. Ricordatevi che ai disgraziati si conviene il vestire a lutto, ed è falso che le nostre canzoni rassomiglino a versi funebri. You should remember that mourning garb befits the wretched, and that our canzoni should resemble funerary verse. Okay, and there's there are other examples. These are only some of the most important ones. Now, what is interesting is that this metaphor elevates itself into what Gilberto Leonardi has called the linea mortifera, a mortiferous line in Leopardi's poetry, that goes through some of these texts, which I have quoted here. For example, Ad Angelo Mai, io son distrutto, né schermo alcuno ho dal dolore che scuro mi è l'avvenire, I cannot see the future. Onde io quasi me stesso e il mondo oblio sedendo in moto, e già mi par che sciolte giaccian le membra mie. As I sit motionless, I seem to forget myself and the world and feel that my limbs have already loosened and they are no longer ruled by mind or spirit. And more, the idea that life is a travagliato sonno, is tormented sleep. Ultimo canto di Sappho, where the persona of the ancient Greek poet exclaims, we will die, morremo. Once the unworthy veil, the naked soul will fly back to this. It's Ultimo canto di Sappho is a canto about suicide indeed, but it is also considered to be Sappho is a bit of a spokesperson for the voice of the poet. We carry on in Le Ricordanze, in 28, abbandonato, occulto, senza amor, senza vita. This linea mortifera goes right through the Canti, certainly as far as A se stesso, which is the last one you can see here, where his heart is being encouraged to stop beating. But it also reaches, in my view, the very final canto, Il tramonto della luna, but we don't have time to talk about that. So there is an interesting intermingling of these of this metaphor of the body sepulchre in the letters that actually turns up in the poetry and in fact at regular intervals. There is a coherence, there is a consistency about it. Now, the coro is, as we will see, a text that does play very much on that metaphor of the body sepulchre. But it appears in a text that is a comic. It's supposed to be a comic, certainly a satirical text. That's what the operette are supposed to do. In Leopardi's mind, when he undertakes the writing, he writes 20 of them between January and November of 1824. What he is striving for is, as he says, uno stile comico. Un nuovo stile comico. You know, lo stile comico in the prosa, in Italian, seems somehow, and lo stile che si occupa di scienza seems to have stopped at Galilei. We don't have anything else. So he says, you know, with these operette, that's what I'm trying to do. So what we have is a very somber text, as we'll see in a minute, which leads into what is quite an amusing situation. Now, I've put there an image of Frederick Ruysch whom Leopardi's friend Pacinotti called Il Ruischio, which I think is quite amusing. Now, Frederick Ruysch became famous. Why? He was a Dutch pharmacologist, and he experimented a lot with the creation of an anatomical specimen for the teaching of anatomy. And he also delighted in creating little compositions. I chose this slide, which I hope is not too triggering. There are others which are a little bit shocking because they are sort of parts of the body being preserved in various jars, and they look a little grim. But the important thing about this is that he became then famous for inventing a particular fluid that is injected into a corpse and allows that corpse not to dry up, but to remain plump and rosy. I'm quoting from Fontenelle describing Ruysch. Plump and rosy, and making the corpse look as though it is still alive. Now, of course, Ruysch wasn't trying like others in his days, and in fact later on, as Olmo would be able to tell you in great detail, he wasn't after trying to resuscitate or bringing back to life corpses. However, he was convinced that this serum would actually help with discovering a way of prolonging life by allowing surgeons to study bodies clearly without them decaying, and eventually making life longer, and so on. Those who have read Leopardi know that the idea of prolonging life for Leopardi is madness, because life is a torment, and thank God for death at the end of it. So why prolong this torment when there is clearly, this, to him, people like Ruysch and then the great scientists of the 19th century who were working on trying to prolong life, like our friend Hooverland, you know, they represented the false belief in progress that the Enlightenment had engendered, and that that Romanticism was further encouraging. Okay. So he writes this operetta, and this operetta is very much teasing Ruysch, because the setting is this, very briefly. Ruysch hears, he's asleep, and he hears some voices coming from his basement. So he creeps downstairs, looks through the keyhole, and he realizes that the bodies that he had embalmed have become alive again. They've come back to life. And he's, on the one hand, a little frightened. On the other, he's very annoyed about it because they're making a hell of a racket. And so he goes in and he says, you know, why are you shouting like gully, like cockerels? You know, this is terrible. And these dead explain to him that once every 1,000 years, there is a particular cosmological conjunction that allows all the dead from any part of the world to wake up and sing this canzoncina. Now, canzoncina, you don't expect a coro tragico to be called canzoncina, do you? But so they say, you know, we sing this canzoncina. Now, Then the operetta continues with this dialogue between Ruysch and one of the dead, which is constantly at cross purposes from the beginning to end. Obviously, they can't understand each other. And the questions that Ruysch poses, for example, what do you actually feel when you die? Yes? And what's death like? Yes? The constant answer of these dead is, we're dead. When we're dead, we're dead. Yes, summarizing rather quickly, but that's the succo of it. We don't remember. We don't remember anything. We don't remember life. And this, of course, is a great shock to Ruysch. And in the end, he has to go back to bed disappointed. And the dead go back to being dead. Okay, so I think this is the Mummie, you know. It's because I'm not talking about them enough that they're actually doing this to me, because they're rather mascots of mine. Okay, so from canzone, the canzoni before the operette, to canzoncina and the coro. And I'm very sorry, you have the text on your handout. The coro consists of a self-contained stanza di canzone in hendecasyllables and settenari. It is a closed structure, as I'm going to suggest, where closure is achieved through specular repetition, articulating in no uncertain terms the utter reversibility of life and death. The lexus excels in abstraction and is intertextually bound to the canti, natura, dolore, pensiero, punto acerbo, speme, desio, ignoto, arcano. This takes us all the way back, straight all the way back to Sappho. Arcano è tutto fuorché il nostro dolor, she says. Everything is unknowable except our suffering. Equally, the vivemmo that you find in the text is a strong memory of Sappho's morremo. So it places the dead on the opposite shore to Sappho, thus completing the journey from life to death. The second half of the canto closing the circle. The gnomic last two lines, the ones that say, sorry, I've lost it now, which is not good. Però che esser beato nega ai mortali e nega ai morti il fato, the fate denies happiness both to the living and to the dead, is ends with a parallelism that is a summa of Leopardi's views over mortality and over the fate of humanity. It is important to realize that there is no progression of argument in this text. Above all, there is no movement, but rather a frozen stasis. The somber tone is monotonous and monochrome. The verb posa, to lie down, which is an anticipation of a se stesso, posa per sempre, lie down forever, addressed to the poet's heart. This in particular defines the posture of these dead, indeed mummified, albeit in a very peculiar way, in a time that has no past, let alone a future. Memory fails. Life, forgive me, is a distance confusa rimembranza. It's a confused memory. Rimembranza is one of the great key words of the Canti. The dead simply cannot remember life, and they find death infinitely more reassuring. This life, they say, is lieta, is not happy, but sicura, dall'antico dolor. We are safe here from the ancient pain of living. I believe it is possible to speak here of a highly accomplished moment of synthesis for Leopardi, forgive me, achieved through the subsuming of the subjective voice to the collective one of the dead. Subsuming or self-suppressing, because here the subject and all the verbs are in the plural. And we haven't actually seen this in Leopardi before. Perhaps what it achieves is what Franco D'Intino calls un'imitazione statica di se stesso, a static imitation of himself. Now, far from wanting to apply any psychobiography to my reading, I think it is important to recognize that the images that have been used here have been long acknowledged as a characteristic of the melancholia depression experienced after a major loss. From Burton to Freud and beyond, feeling dried up inside, inwardly dead, figuratively defines the feeling induced by a devastating loss, be it a loved person or a condition that is now irretrievable or no longer reproducible. This is what Kristeva teaches us. Or indeed the Lacanian shores as irretrievably lost, as it is indefinable. The subject is affected spatially and temporally, reducing itself to akinesis, to immobility. Sorry, let me just bring next slide. I think you're about to hear some swear words in Venetian. Okay. So these are what you have here is an example that I will come back to of the way in which the beginning and the end of the poem work. Now, when I was researching and I was discussing with Adele and Francesco and the others, I came across a very good and very interesting, very touching book by Denise Riley, which is called Time Lived Without Its Flow. And it's a book that she wrote after the death of her son, Jake. And Denise Riley, writing about that loss, writes, "I see as if I am myself dead. Death, and in particular the death of another, brings us something much worse than thinking and thoughts, or even mourning as we understand it in the Freudian sense. What it brings us is the timelessness of being dead. So that on the one hand, we are alive and we are physically alive, but in fact, we live in what she calls arrested time. Now, I think that what we have in the coro is precisely that arrested time, a private non-time of pure stasis. So that the mourner is no longer in time, despite the fact of being still and inexorably alive. They are alive for a short moment. Giacomo and the poetic persona of the Canti is alive, painfully alive, but trapped in this timelessness of loss, which is a loss of youth, which is a loss of illusions, which is a loss of love. Riley also suggests that this timelessness and this experience of being alive but within a timelessness is foundational and is indeed to do with a change in the entire structure of cognition. We understand things and we learn about things in an entirely different way. And what you do is basically abide. You abide. That's all you can do. Now, you are pure skin stretched tightly over vacancy. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful definition. However, you abide not as an extinguished self, but as a self locked out of sequence. Sorry, I've lost my place. Apologies. Out of sequence. Now, writing is a condition that this state fights against. Your very condition, this stasis, militates against narrative. Narrative is no longer possible because this condition of being both locked in and out means that you lack any sense of futurity, of future. You can't take the lightest interest in the activity of writing unless you possess some feeling of futurity. I think that that is again what happens here. There is no future because these go back to being dead. And I'm going to, no, I've got time, sorry, I'm worried about taking too much of your time. Now, let us come back to the coro. Leopardi chooses a form, which is the form of the chorus that is inspired by the genre of the tragic chorus, partly because the collective voice allows him to avoid a single subject, It allows him, in other words, to seek a tragic tone in the lyric. And this is what he writes. I regard this use of the chorus, of the tragic chorus, as part of that vagueness, the indefiniteness, which is the principal cause of the charm of ancient poetry and fine literature. The individual, he says, is always a paltry thing, and often an ugly, often a contemptible one. The beautiful and the great need indefiniteness, and this indefiniteness can be only brought on to the stage by bringing on the multitude. Of course, that is his reading of the chorus in traditional ancient tragedy. This collective and anonymous voice, continues Leopardi, was not that of human individuals, and enabled that voice, that collective voice, to engage in profound and sublime reflections. As a consequence, even when the chorus took active part in the action, it was always more poetic. This is where allows Leopardi to create the connection between the tragic and the poetic. It is the very nature of that subject, indefinite, multitudinous, that makes it possible to pronounce the trans-subjective nature of truth, becoming a sort of mouthpiece. Now, Gilberto Leonardi, again, who's one of the great Leopardisti of our time, stresses that the difference between the canzoni, canto, and this coro lies in the way in which prosopopeia can be employed. In the case of Ultimo Canto di Sappho, for example, where it is Sappho who is supposed to be speaking, and certainly in the chorus here. So when Leopardi chooses to employ a stanza di canzone, but with a plural subject, this is what he's aiming at. He's employing prosopopeia, and he's aiming at a kind of lyric that will allow great statements, nomic statements, and that will be perceived to be a general truth. The last two steps that I'm going to take in talking about this consist in the fact that we can consider the coro a corpse poem. This is a term used by Diana Fuss in her Dying Modern. And this is what she, forgive me, this is what she says. A dead body and the poetic discourse are mutually incompatible. Two formal states, each precluding the other. A poem implies subjective depth, while a corpse testifies to its absence. A poem quickens language, while a corpse stills it. The fantastical coupling of corpse and poem denotes an extravagant rhetorical conceit, an impossible literary utterance. So what this coro as a corpse poem actually does, it actually affirms the impossibility of literary utterance. The morti here have a voice, as in any corpse poem, that irretrievably breach the boundary between the place where language intensifies and the place where language vanishes. So that in elegy, language is intensified because you're on the threshold of death. But if you go beyond that threshold and you enter the world of the dead, then language vanishes. Language cannot and does not exist in death. I found this really very stimulating and very interesting. She also quotes Paul Demain when he underlines that by succumbing to the fiction that the dead may speak, we give voice to the haunting within ourselves, which ensures that we're also deprived of our own voice. Okay, so there's no subjective voice here. It's not possible. It cannot be. It cannot be there. While we may consider that Leopardi might be ventriloquizing his dead self, thus performing a lyric utterance from inside the place where the dead dwell, it must be recognized that what we have in front of us is what Fuss calls an insensate figure that actually challenges the modality of elegy. So this coro is not actually an elegy. It cannot be defined as such because it comes from death, it comes from the dead, but there is no regret there. There is no real mourning for the loss of life because life can't be remembered. It is something that is now utterly and completely removed. So what do I mean when I say that the coro is an example of poetry mummified? What I mean is something that has to do with its perfect balance. This is actually a perfectly balanced text. As I said before, it doesn't allow movement because from the beginning to the end there is no progression, but only the repetition of the same. Nostra in te morte si posa, nostra ignota natura, lieta no ma sicura dall'antico dolor, profonda notte nella confusa mente, il pensier grave oscura. That's in the first half of the poem. And then, towards the end, come da morte vivendo rifugia, così rifugge dalla fiamma vitale nostra ignuda natura, lieta no, ma sicura, però ch'esser beato nega ai mortali e nega ai morti il fato. We are tempted to say, okay, where do we go from here? Because it seems to me that this sealed poem doesn't allow any future to the lyric, or to the lyric as Leopardi has considered it so far. And I'm profoundly convinced that it was the impasse that took him to stop writing poetry in 23. He could because it's not because he was unhappy. It's not because he was ill. It is not because Recanati was being beastly to him. It is because he could see that there was a problem with the kind of poetry that he had been writing, and he couldn't get out of that problem. He needed, first of all, to explore prose, to explore his ideas about life, death, fate, nature, but he also needed to spend some time away from the lyric, so that when he goes back to it with the glorious Silvia, something crucial has happened. Let me quote something to you, and I hope that this is the last slide. You'll be happy to know. Boy, am I going to be happy that it is the last slide. Done, it's there, wonderful, fantastic. Okay. This is an important, very, very important quotation. And I must thank Franco Dintino. I hope that Franco's there in the ether. Listen to this. Thank you very much for this. It's a quotation from the Zibaldone, from Leopardi's notebook. I will not, well, I can read it in Italian, why not? Una poesia che lascia gli affetti dei lettori o uditori in pienissimo equilibrio si chiama poesia? Produce un effetto poetico? Che altro vuol dire essere in pieno equilibrio se non essere quieti senza tempesta né commozione alcuna? E qual altro è il proprio officio e scopo della poesia se non il commuovere così o così, ma sempre commuovere gli affetti? Now it seems to me that what we have here is that sense, that, you know, that calm, that lack of agitation, that perfect product that the coro is, lacks something fundamental. Paradoxically, a text that is supposed to talk about life and death, it doesn't move. It doesn't move us. And moving the feelings is what poetry should do. And that's what the lyric must do. So that when he goes back to writing the wonderful Canti Pisano Recanatesi, he takes a different tack. We don't have time to talk about what that tack. But of course, the memory comes in and plays a fundamental role. Yes, it needs a dead girl. It needs Sylvia. It needs a recognizable, identifiable object that can be mourned, that has been lost and can be mourned. And at that point, the lyric voice frees itself and sings. No longer trapped in time, and his voice at last is own. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.